want to bring this back to the context of anthropology and what we started doing. We went out about 100 years ago. You've been reading about Boaz and Margaret Mead. It was about 100 years ago, give or take. Started doing this thing called ethnographic fieldwork. And it was at a time when people in Europe and in the United States, a lot of people just assumed that the people out there, the people who were in different societies, were at best not efficiently using their resources. The hunters and gatherers were inefficient. You may have been taught even in grade school that hunting and gathering can only support like one person for every 40 acres, which is the idea that it's inefficient. Or, so that would be the best, if they weren't doing things the right way or the smart way. And at worst are just dumb. They're just not doing anything good at all. One of the sort of ideologies which sustained this idea was called the tragedy of the commons, which was came to us via Garrett Hardin in the 1960s. And in some ways, the tragedy of the commons is simply the expression. I'm going to be a little bit harsh on Hardin. He probably is smarter than I'm making him out to be. But it's in some ways the expression of an ideology that people are going to be selfish, and that in a situation in which land and other resources, oceans, water, lakes, mountains, and in situations where they're held in common, right, the commons, that there's going to be overuse because everybody's just going to put in one more pig or take out one more fish or hunt one more antelope. And if everybody is just acting in their own interest, selfishly, then it will deplete the resources of that environment and there will be a tragedy. It will be unsustainable. So that reservation where Mickey's going to go to, that would be, since it was land held in common, that they would inevitably overuse it and overgraze it. And so the idea was you had to have private property, of course, and if you made things private, then people would cut off access, and you'd be able to efficiently use the land without overusing it. Now, this turns out to be baloney. And anthropology, in contrast to what had been done before, documented, as we've talked about, the skills of other peoples. We talked in the last class about foraging and horticulture and pastoralism and intensive agriculture. And we documented the skills and the uses and how people were able to adapt to different landscapes in very ingenious ways, but also how they had social agreements about who uses what. So the idea that if it's a common land, it just belongs to everybody and you can do whatever you want is actually a misstatement of the ways in which people would interact with each other and discuss and talk about and come to an agreement about what kind of resources to use the land. So anthropology does this probably. We did a pretty good job at this. But even as anthropology is doing this, everybody assumed that those things were going away. Those ways, the other ways in which people had maybe their horticulture or their pastoralism, or especially hunting and gathering, that it was going to disappear. And it was the job of anthropology, as we've seen in Charles King and the Gods of the Upper Air, to capture this stuff and dig it up and extract it before it all went away, before the bulldozers came in and got everything. And so the idea was that, oh yes, people had these skills, but their way of life was going away. It's all disappearing. Now when we come to today's world, to the now, what we see is something that is interesting that has happened, which is 100 years later, into the now, 100 years after anthropologists did this and all those assumptions were going on, that certainly a lot of customs and things and people have certainly been hurt by the advance of different forms of life, colonialism, these things. But in ways that we never would have anticipated, there's been a lot of recuperation of indigenous languages, indigenous ideas, traditions. And there's Mickey going on to a Native American reservation within driving distance, right? Who would have thought 100 years ago, you'd be like, nah, that's not gonna exist anymore. There's not gonna be anybody who identifies as Native American or indigenous. That would have seemed like something that was disappearing. We read about this in when we were talking about Deloria and her work and how she was trying to say, wait a second, this is not just a disappearing language. This is a language or something that is happening in the now. So on the one hand, a lot has disappeared. We've also discovered something about the world and about the resources we have, which we once thought we could just go in and just, oh, the world seems so big. What do we know now, Juliana, about the world? There's, I guess, yeah, limited resources. So yeah, there is a definite quantity of resources and we can't just use them all up. And so the idea that the best thing to do is to privatize the land and split it all up and turn everything into a profit-generating mechanisms, in many cases, doesn't turn out to be the most efficient way to use our resources. Or it turns out to be just dumb. So the things that we thought were inefficient and stupid, the way people were using the land in terms of hunting and gathering or horticulture or pastoralism, even slash and burn agriculture, which looked dumb from the outside, turns out to be a sustainable way to use the land in many different environments. And what we instead see is that the silver and gold extraction that we took out of the mines of the Americas, I think I've talked to you in other classes about the mines of Potosí and the way in which it was mined for silver to invigorate the world's economy, that left this whole place as an environmental disaster. Or we talked in the last class about the sugar plantations, tobacco plantations, cotton plantations, which were massively depleting of the soil. And some of the richest plantations, the best places for all these things, are now basically wastelands because of the ways in which agriculture, the plantation agriculture ruined the soil, and the same thing with industrial production and industrial agriculture in the way in which it was miraculous in terms of its first chemical inputs and fertilizer and pesticides, but then the pests come back bigger and worse in the land, the soil gets depleted, or it gets basically run on an oil economy. And of course, we know the consequences of putting all those gases into the air. And so we've come to a point where it doesn't seem like the way we're doing things is sustainable. And I'm not trying, I don't want to get too hippie here, and I don't want to get into a political argument, but it just doesn't seem like the ways in which we're running our industries and the ways in which we're doing things is going to be able to cope with the limited resources that we have and the limits of production. Now, I don't know, we're going to try and find different ways to use these things, and hopefully quickly, before we get into irreversible change. But there we go. The 3 pillars of sustainability that Seth told us about: social, economic, environment. And then you have the overlap of social and environment is bearable. overlap of environment and economic is viable, and overlap of economic and social is equitable. And if you have all three overlapping, it becomes sustainable. I think that all makes sense, maybe. Taylor, you like this too. Actually, you were surprised that you liked this. Why were you surprised?
But it was kind of interesting to see the graph, like see how it would be.
I do like this graphic. There's another one on the next page too. It does seem like it could have been a boring topic. Well, I'm glad you liked it, despite the initial potential for boredom. Yeah. So, got the three pillars of sustainability. That's a neat thing to do. So, let's see. What can anthropology contribute to this sometimes boring field? What do you say, Felicia? What can we do?
Anthropology is working intensively with conservation groups and community organizations to help with like the environments.
Yeah, and getting that TEK. What's that?
It's also called like local knowledge. It seeks to understand the collective and cumulative knowledge that a group of people has gained through living in the particular ecosystem. So it's like a connection with Indigenous people on environmental topics.
Yeah, so traditional ecological knowledge. And I think, Taylor, you're absolutely correct. In some ways, this sounds kind of boring because it's just people going in and talking to old people. It's that old style, just going in, doing your field work, talking to people, and trying to figure out what they know about their environment and their knowledge about things. But this turns out to be super helpful in today's world because it turns out they knew a lot more than we thought they did. And so if you look a little bit further, the idea of ethnoecology. So we know about ecology, but ethnoecology is talking to people who actually live in these environments and have been living there for many years. And so again, the idea is those people that we didn't think had anything to tell us about anything, turns out they may have something to tell us. And it strikes me that over the years that anthropology, I used to think maybe it was too big of a discipline. We're taking, of course, just the cultural anthropology part, which is also huge. It's a huge topic. We could study lots and lots of things as we have in this class. But in the four fields anthropology that many of you have been experiencing, you also do archaeology and biological anthropology. But I think now that this is probably exactly what the kinds of things that we need in the world. We need that archaeology to talk to us about long-term sustainability and the long-term production of material culture and the ways in which different societies could be sustainable over thousands of years. We need more than hundreds of years. We need thousands. And we need the biological anthropologists to tell us about human evolution and how people's bodies are flexible and change, and we can eat all kinds of different things, as we discovered in the last chapter, or chapter 5, that the human body is incredibly adaptable at eating things from 90% animal protein to almost zero animal protein. So, but how does our biology change in different environments? How might our biology change in changing climates over time? And how does that all interact with social knowledge, ecological knowledge, the old-fashioned, boring question of how do people interact with their environment? which I think we're gonna do a lot of next semester in cultural ecology. So that's gonna be lots of boring stuff. And then at the very end, we get this whole yay us, yay anthropology professors. Well, yay the anthropology professors that are doing stuff like, teaching and sustainability studies and building organic farms and all these things. So good for them. That's good. Like it. So hopefully this will help us be more sustainable.